In March 1895, in a rural area of County Tipperary, Ireland, a woman was consumed by fire in the very heart of her own home. It was not strangers who were responsible, but the people who knew her best, her family and neighbors, who will later insist that they believed they were doing the right thing. Bridget was not a social outcast, not an isolated old woman. She was, at the standard of her time, modern and independent. Well-dressed, childless, known locally for her interest in folklore. When she fell ill with what we will recognize as a severe case of bronchitis, her physical deterioration, fever, delirium, and a lack of improvement over several days began to raise suspicions. It was said that she had spent too much time near an ancient ring fort on Killenagrana Hill, a place avoided for centuries and believed to be fairy territory. When medicine failed and her illness didn't subside, an older explanation took hold. Bridget was no longer Bridget. According to this belief, something else had taken her place. A sickly impostor left behind by the fairy folk, and the only way to recover the real woman was to drive the creature out. To understand what happened to Bridget, we have to look beyond her story and into the folklore of the Changeling itself, a belief that did not merely explain the unexplainable, but quietly decided who was still human and who was not. This is not an easy topic. It seems like something about fairies, something that could be cute or nice, but it's not. It's speak about suffering of many children and families for centuries, and even if it's historical, still a little bit difficult to hear, especially because we thought we had made a better world for children, yet so many recent events suggest sadly otherwise. So if you are not ready for this kind of content, feel free to skip this video and come later for any other topic. And now let's continue with Bridget's story. For several days, Bridget was forced to drink herbal concoctions, subjected to repeated interrogations, and compelled to answer questions designed to prove whether she was still herself. The process was led by her husband, Michael Cleary, and her uncle, Jack Dunn, a Senchai in Irish culture, a traditional storyteller well-versed in herbal lore. They insisted the woman before them was not Michael's wife, but a changeling, and that the real Bridget was being held captive in the fairy world. On the final nights, after hours of mounting tension, Michael used kerosene from a lamp to set her alight, convinced, as he will later testify, that fire will force the creature to lift her. Bridget died in the flames, while several relatives looked on. One witness later testified that when he shouted at Michael Cleary to stop, Cleary replied, "She's not my wife. She's an old impostor sent in her place. She has been deceiving me for the past 7 or 8 days. She even deceived the priest today, but she will deceive no one again." Michael Cleary did not flee. For 3 days, he waited near the spot when he believed Bridget would return, restored, healthy, and human, as the stories promised. But she never did. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison for manslaughter, and 15 years later, after his release, emigrated to Canada. The murder of Bridget Cleary was not the only act of violence rooted in changeling beliefs, but it was one of the last and one of the most visible collisions between ancient superstition and the modern world. To understand why Bridget's murder could happen in 1895, we need to look at where this belief began, in the nursery. For centuries in Ireland, Scotland, and rural parts of Europe, suspicions, accusations, and rituals were documented, aimed at testing whether a child, a sick woman, or a frail elder had been replaced by a changeling. But what exactly is a changeling? In the past centuries, the idea that a child could be swapped for a fairy being was part of everyday life. Certain supernatural creatures, fairies, elves, or trolls, were believed to steal human children, leaving in their place a deformed, sickly, or strangely aged offspring, incapable of developing normally. To the community, that child was no longer the same. As we discussed in the previous video, the fairies of the older folklore had little in common with the kind, glowing figures of modern popular culture or cinema. They were feared, powerful, and deeply ambiguous entities, capable of bestowing blessings or taking everything away. In this context, the changeling became the most unsettling manifestation of that threat, a familiar body that no longer contained the beloved person. Perhaps that is why, among all fairy tales, none captures their darker side better than the story of the swapped child. When a baby fell ill, failed to grow, or displayed behaviors deemed unusual by their family, many believed they were dealing with a changeling, an impostor left by the fairies. To confirm it, they turned to rituals that now seemed bewildering: boiling water in eggshells, pretending to brew beer in tiny vessels, or placing iron near the cradle. These acts were intended to provoke a reaction from the changeling, who might laugh with a knowledge impossible for their supposed age, revealing their supernatural origin. Leaving children exposed to the cold of night, immersing them in water, striking them with birch rods, or bringing them dangerously close to the heat of jowls and forges. These practices, documented in medieval accounts and court records from the 16th to the 19th century, reveal a world in which superstition could tragically turn care into punishment. Most disturbingly, these beliefs were not confined to oral tradition. From the Middle Ages, theological and legal texts recorded them as debated realities. In the early 13th century, Bishop William of Auburn described changelings as demonic offspring, devoid of a human soul. The Malleus Maleficarum, the famous 1486 treatise systematizing methods of identify, judge, and punish practitioners of witchcraft, legitimized the belief that anomalies in babies and children, from illness to strange behaviors, could be the work of supernatural forces. The text advised through examinations, purification rituals, and in extreme cases, punishments unimaginable today, all in the name of protecting the human soul from diabolical impostors. Thus, the line between myths and religious doctrine became blurred, and the influence of the Malleus spread across Europe, reinforcing popular beliefs and local traditions regarding child swapping. During the Reformation, Martin Luther described at least one severely disabled child as the work of Satan, and suggested that such a being should not be allowed to live. Stories later collected by the Brothers Grimm show how these ideas continued to justify extreme acts in the name of restoring natural order. The changeling belief emerged most clearly in Irish folklore, and it is in this region that the belief takes its most defined form. There, it was said that the Aishi could carry off children, especially if they were envied by others or if the mother was in a liminal state, such as the postpartum period. To discover a changeling, people resorted to tricks such as boiling eggshells to provoke it into speaking, forcing it to reveal its nature, but also to darker methods, such as putting the child into the fire. In the Scottish lowlands and the north of England, similar stories were told about elves who replaced children. A common method of exposing them was to provoke their surprise so that they would speak or laugh, showing knowledge improper for a child. In Scottish folklore, it was believed that every 7 years the fairies had to deliver a soul to hell, and exchanging children was a way to avoid sacrificing their own. In Wales, the Tulwig sometimes swapped their children for human infants, and the changelings were said to become progressively uglier and more difficult in both appearance and behavior. Farther north in Scandinavia, the story repeats under different names. Here, it was not fairies but trolls or subterranean beings who carried out the exchange. It was believed that trolls feared iron, so scissors or knives were placed in the cradle as protection. If a child was replaced, some stories mention that mistreating the changeling, for example with fire, would force the trolls to return the human child. In Poland, the Slavic spirit Mamuna was said to exchange babies and could be recognized by abnormal physical features. To recover the real child, some legends describe symbolic rituals in which the mother demanded the return of her son. In the Germanic regions, people spoke of the Wechselbach, literally the changed child. These beings varied depending on the region. They were said to be left in place of human children by witches of elves, and similar methods were used to determine whether a child was a changeling, ranging from provoking it to react or confess to more brutal practices. If we move south in Europe, in northern Spain we find a fascinating variant. The chanas, nymphs of rivers and spring, sometimes swap their children, the chaninos, with human babies. Some versions claimed they did so to have their children baptized, others because the chanas couldn't nurse them themselves. One way of identifying them, similar to the method used in Wales, was to place eggshells by the fire until the child revealed an impossible wisdom for its age, exclaiming, "I was born 100 years ago, and since then I have never seen so many eggshells by the fire." Beyond Europe, the idea persists in other forms. Among the Igbo of Nigeria, the Ogbanje was not a stolen child, but a spirit that returned repeatedly to the same household, causing repeated infant deaths. The solution was not to punish the child, but to break the spiritual bond that tied it into the human world. The changeling myths also crossed the Atlantic, appearing sporadically in communities of Irish, Scottish, and German descent in the United States. Unlike in Europe, where the changeling was part of a shared system of beliefs, in America these stories appeared as scattered echoes. One of the best documented cases comes from Iowa in 1886, when it was believed that a young woman, Miss Kitty Crow, had been taken by the fairies. The following story is quoted from a paper in Iowa. 3 days, Miss Kitty stayed away from the fairies. On the third day, she told her married sister that she had to go again, that the fairies could do without her no longer. The sister followed her upstairs and, according to a Dubuque dispatch, saw two queer-looking beings, resembling men, dressed in antiquated black, and with them the girl left the house. She saw them go up the street. After they had gone half a block, all three suddenly disappeared in the air. Since with nothing has been heard of the missing girl, there the story ends, so far as the outside world is given to know. Far from disappearing, the belief in changed children persisted in rural areas well into the late 19th century, as Irish Folklore Commission archives show, preserving hundreds of first-hand accounts. Across all these testimonies runs the same logic. When illness, disability, or infant death had no explanation, people turned to the supernatural. The changeling was a shared cultural response to the oldest fear of all, that the child you love may no longer, in fact, be your own. When in rare occasions these acts reached the courts, the judicial response was far from consistent. In 1690, on the Swedish island of Gotland, a couple was convicted after leaving their 10-year-old son on a heap of manure on Christmas Eve. The boy was sickly and failing to thrive, and his parents believed he had been swapped. According to their logic, abandoning him in this way would force the elves to return the true child. The boy froze to death, and the Swedish court held the parents responsible. In Southern Ireland, an elderly woman named Anne Roach drowned her 4-year-old grandson, Michael Leahy, who was unable to walk. At trial, Roach declared that she had acted to banish the fairy she believed was controlling him. She was acquitted. In both cases, the explanation was the same. What changed was society's and the justice system's willingness to accept that a myth could justify a child's death. There are other documented cases in Ireland and Scotland in which children died during rituals meant to drive out the fairies. In other words, they were killed. This was the case of Joe Mahoney and Mary Ann Kelly. These are real stories, deeply disturbing ones, and I will not describe them here, but I thought their names deserved to be spoken. Even kings were not immune to these beliefs. In the 17th century, a rumor circulated that Charles I of England might have been a changeling. As a child, he was described as sickly, irritable, and unsociable, traits that, in a deeply superstitious era, sparked suspicion. His nurse claimed to have seen a mysterious figure appear at his cradle, cover him with a cloak, and then vanished. There is, of course, no evidence. Yet the mere existence of the rumor reveals something significant. Belief in Changeling was so real to people of the time that even a future king could be regarded with suspicion. What does modern medicine have to say about these cases? In historical accounts, changelings were described as infants or young children showing unusual signs: insatiable appetite without weight gain, delays in physical or mental development, odd behaviors such as precocious speech, persistent crying, and appearances suggesting premature aging. Anthropological and historical analysis suggest that this tradition functioned as a cultural mechanism for understanding congenital conditions, intellectual disabilities, and developmental disorders that we can now recognize. Behaviors like social withdrawal, resistance to physical contact, or repetitive actions were associated with the presence of a changeling, when in reality they reflected traits of undiagnosed autism spectrum disorders. Other syndromes, including Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, phenylketonuria, or congenital hypothyroidism, may have inspired attributions to fairy substitution due to unusual physical traits, growth delays, or progressive deterioration that exceeded the medical understanding of the time. Even rare conditions such as progeria, which accelerate childhood aging, match the accounts of children with aged or fragile appearances. From a psychological perspective, belief in changelings offer parents a pre-scientific mechanism to process frustration, fear, and guilt when their children fail to thrive. Externalizing these difficulties onto a supernatural impostor helps alleviate despair and provide a sense of agency. Through rituals, exorcism, or tests, caregivers could feel they were acting to restore the natural order. This narrative, reinforced by consultation with clergy or local wise people, also legitimized extreme measures that we will now consider abusive and disturbing, from exposure to coal or fire to, in tragic cases, the loss of the supposed changeling's life. In societies where every member needed to be productive to survive, sick or dependent child were tragically seen as an impossible burden. The changeling myth offered a justification. The family had not failed, the supernatural had intervened. Today, we no longer speak of fairy hills or iron rituals, but the suspicion persists. Only the stage has changed. Instead of babies in cradles, we watch celebrities, public figures whose image shifts, whose behavior seems different, whose voice, face, or personality no longer match the audience memory. From these emerge rumors. They are not the same person anymore. Something happened to them. They have been replaced, not by fairies, but by clones, doppelgangers, artificial intelligence, or conspiracies. The language has changed, but the anxiety is the same. Someone close to us has been altered, and we need a story to explain why. For centuries, the changeling was more than a creature of folklore. It was a desperate way to make sense of illness, disability, and infant death in a world without medicine, diagnosis, or social safety nets. When a baby suddenly fell ill, failed to grow, or did not respond as expected, suspicion offered a cruel but culturally accepted outlet. That child was no longer human. And if they were no longer seen as human, punishment ceased to feel like a crime. As Catherine Mary Brick noted, many of the rituals intended to restore the real child caused incalculable suffering, yet they didn't always arise from hatred, but from fear and from the conviction that this was not a child but an impostor. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable truth of all. The changeling doesn't speak of fairies, it speaks of what happens when a society stops recognizing the humanity of its most vulnerable, because the real monster was never the changed child, but the need to believe that they were monsters. Thank you for seeing the video. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. See you next week.